Hey guys, I'm just going to go through this video that has David Pallmann in it. Now, David Pallmann, he's quite an interesting young man. I've listened to quite a bit of his channel. He talks about all different types of issues. Um, but I've found that on some of the issues, um, while he's going deep into intellectualism, on certain issues. On others, he seems to just drop the ball completely. And this we all do this, and I'm not just saying this is a fault of him, but I hope in a way that if he watches this, which I think he will, because I'm doing it specifically on him, and I'm not picking on him. If this was someone else, if this, I think it was David who organised a debate between Stephen Boyce and myself. Now, if this was Russell, the other guy who was part of that debate, if he was saying this, I would do a video on him. So I'm not just picking on David. I do find his search for knowledge refreshing, and I think a lot of people find that where he's constantly going down certain avenues to just, he finds a cave, he goes down it and just tries to find what's in there. But there are a lot of really intellectual people on the planet who can be very intellectual in one area but miss the boat in another. Someone like Noam Chomsky comes to mind, a brilliant linguist. He has a knack for explaining um, political scenarios, what's happening in the world, what's happening in South America or something like that, in some failed state in the Middle East, and how things got there. But if you listen to his solutions or you listen to his um, his theories on economics, it's like, does this guy really know anything about that? And so that's what I found listening to David talk about King James onlyism here. And I guess this video, hopefully, he might never watch it, but hopefully, if he does watch it, he will think, well, I really have to sharpen up my sword on this because um, it just seems like he's anti King James onlyism is because he experienced some really um, low hanging fruit, and he experienced bullying by a bunch of Baptist guys. And so when I watched through this clip, I heard the King James stuff. I thought I'm going to do a video on that, and I listened right to the end just in case they brought up they did bring up just one other little thing, so I've tagged it on the end. But I was sort of feeling, my heart went out for both of these guys. They've been involved in churches that have totally burnt them, and I know what that's like. I've been in a church and had you're sort of doing everything that you know to be right, but you still end up being wrong somehow. And so this is the nature of your dead religion. This is the nature of religious fanaticism, and so I understand where these guys have come from. But one thing I've learnt also is not to have experienced based theology. Now, sometimes it's only the charismatics, or sometimes I call them charismaniacs, um, who get accused of experience based theology. They cast out a demon out of their house, and then the next day someone gave them $20, and so, we got rid of the anti money demon. Just this experience based theology. Um, can it's throughout all of Christianity. It doesn't seem to matter who's like, I've been in many different countries and seen many different Christian traditions, and many people here in Australia, Papua New Guinea, Cambodia, New Zealand, Pakistan, different places, Malaysia, Indonesia. Many people have different stories to do with that, and so what I find is with people can react to something working, but also when something doesn't work. And so, say like someone like Justin Peters, he got prayed for and it didn't work, and so now he goes around basically. He'll talk about Benny Hinn and talk about these other frauds, obvious frauds, but then he just uses that as a bit of a platform to say, all healing is gone. Um, all gifts of the Holy Spirit have faded away. And so, what I find is there can be a reactionary um, uh, theology made up by people, and I've done that myself, and I've been very careful not to do that. Where what I've had to do is give credit where credit's due, even if there's someone I absolutely despise and don't like their theology, don't like their foul attitude, don't like the way they treated me or whatever. Sometimes they can be right, and I have to agree with them. And so, obviously, the Bible issue is one issue that I know quite a lot about. I challenge lots of people to debate me. It's pretty hard to get people to debate me, actually. I've had a few offers lately, but the other people have pulled out, and so, which is quite surprising. Considering as soon as I heard that I was debating this one guy, I watched pretty much everything that he brought out, and I was like, okay, cool. I think I'm up for it. And then he pulled out, and so I think the thing is, people know that I will do my homework on these issues. I will look into um, good argumentation to try and combat what they're saying. And I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to, fudge the facts. I'm not going to cook the books to try to win a debate point or anything. I'm going to look at these things. And well, after the debate, I'm going to look at these things as well. And so I guess because I had the debate with Stephen Boyce and I made some videos about that debate. And what I found was Stephen, he had experienced, I guess, King James onlyism, or what he would call Texas Receptus onlyism. But it's obviously not the type of Texas Receptus type of stuff that I've been involved in, or many other people who I know online or personally. Now, I do know people who have been involved in King James only weirdo stuff, or Texas Receptus weirdo stuff, it's out there. Everything has that type of thing. I mean, you can meet people who, they have a really good political point of view, but they're into weirdo stuff. Like I really used to like and follow, say, Ron Paul type of stuff. And I noticed the guys on Apologia had him on for an interview, and I was like, these guys are into that. It's like he's my guy. I like his stuff, and I've actually learned quite a lot from his presidential runs in 2008 and reading a lot of his books. And he's quite a fascinating guy. I don't agree with him on everything, but it's like, okay, he's got some really good points on the world and on libertarianism and all the rest of it. And so, anyway, I'm sort of rabbit trailing a little bit here. So, what I'll do is I'll just play this video. It's only 13 minutes. I've cut it right down. Um, but it's basically one huge, like, 12-minute chunk of chatting and then just another little thing tagged on the end. So I'm going to let David and the guy who calls himself Mr. Always Right here. And so he's part of the church split. And I noticed he has done quite a few videos on King James onlyism. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of his videos and offer my critique of them. Um, I've I've received a few a few messages from people who don't like my critiques, and it's like, well, if you're going to be online, if you're going to be a public figure, if you're going to say things about anything, you're going to get critiques, and so yeah. So anyway, I'm going to stop rabbit trailing. It's actually 12:35 in the morning here in Australia. Why I'm up so late, I have no idea, but I just want to get through this, and so hopefully I don't start waffling on. I've got a bunch of biscuits here to keep my sugar levels up so I can stay awake. But I'm going to start letting David chat and speak for himself.
So my issues with the King James.
Okay, so I'll just turn this up a bit.
Yes, that was the next thing that went for me. Because I was interested in apologetics, and I was interested kind of in this question of, is the Bible reliable? Like, this was kind of an interesting thing, right? Because like I mentioned before that, like, when my faith, like, when it was shaken, right, when I kind of lost my faith, as it were, but not completely, like I hadn't apostatized, but I was just like so doubting, was Christianity true, that when I started to rebuild it, when it came back, I say it looked a little different than what I had, the Christianity I'd been taught, and that's kind of probably what happens when you start thinking for yourself, is that it's probably, if your theology looks exactly like the theology you've been taught, it probably means someone else is doing the thinking for you.
Okay, so and that's a good point, but also what we can say is um, that it doesn't necessarily, you don't have to go to an opposite or have your theology changed for it to be true. There can be, you can be involved in a church movement that turns bad, and they were teaching truth on certain things. So there's no point jumping the boat or changing things. Um, and that's what I was saying about reactionary theology or experience-based theology. We've got to be careful that we give credit where credit's due, that we examine the good, the bad, and the ugly, and we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. And not everything has to be changed in our life. Some things, especially in any church. Yeah, you can grow up even a Jehovah's Witness and have 90% of your things wrong, but there's still 10% that's correct. And so you've got to weigh those things up and go, actually, they did teach us one thing that was good. It might only just be one thing, but you could be part of a group where everything's wrong. But what I'm saying is we've just got to be careful that we don't just react for the sake of reacting.
Um, Obviously, that's you might it's possible, but in general, you're probably going to reach some of your own opinions on things, and that's not a bad thing, because again, we can just we can allow for some differences on these areas. But yeah, with the King James issue, it was this question of like, well, is the Bible that we have now, is that the same as the Bible that originally came to us? And so I started looking into like textual criticism, right? I'm reading guys like Bart Ehrman and Dan Wallace and stuff, and both of those guys, while they might really differ on the text of the New Testament.
Well, actually, they don't differ on the text of the New Testament. That's one of the things with Bart Ehrman and Dan Wallace when they had a debate. It was more like a dialogue. They might come to different conclusions where one says, well, I don't believe the Bible is true and I don't believe in God. And the other one says, well, I believe the Bible's true and I believe in God. But when you look at the text, they are actually in agreement. And so if you listen to the debates of Bart Ehrman, he will basically say that what we have today in the Nestle Aland United Bible Society 28th edition is, scholarly and is the work of scholars and is basically the best thing that we can put together today. So that's pretty much what Dan Wallace would say as well. So you've got to understand that these guys are actually part of the same team. They're not opposites. See, people like to make out that these guys are debating each other. James White and Ehrman are debating each other. Oh, so they're on opposite sides of the fence. No, they're on the same side, but they just have different conclusions. And so it's a Republican debating a Republican. It's a Democrat debating a Democrat. There's no real change there. And even if sometimes you get a Republican debating a Democrat, sometimes they can be so similar. There's really nothing that's different there. And um, so that's one of the things that I felt like I wanted to point out with this video is, obviously, if you watch through this video, you can see, David got to a point of crisis in his beliefs. He was, doing really well in his school, but started questioning things and basically got spiritually abused and bullied and all the rest of it. And so I guess, I can understand him, go, okay, well, I'm going to read all this other extreme stuff. And, I read Bart Ehrman stuff as well. Um, Strangely, I ended up with all of Bart Ehrman's books in audio format. And it was quite interesting. The audio format had basically um, every sort of paragraph in its own audio file. So I would sometimes just listen over and over and over to Bart Ehrman stuff. And I would just listen to it until I had an answer in my mind. So I would listen to it and then I would come home, study, and go, actually, that's not a really good That's not a really good point that he's making, because he's leaving this information out. He's not looking at the early church writers, and he contradicts himself. In chapter 1, he was saying this. And so I was going through Bart Ehrman stuff. This is probably about 7 or 8 years ago, and I came to totally different conclusions. It strengthened my belief in the King James. And I didn't grow up King James only. I grew up in a church where people would read the New King James. Some people had other Bible versions and things like that. Now, my first pastor, he ended up sort of being a TR person and sort of brought it up as a bit of an issue. So that got me interested in it. Um, but then from there, I would say the King James had errors in it, and I would say, and one of the reasons I wrote a whole article on Easter in 2005, and that was to originally to prove that Easter was a mistranslation in the King James. And so I didn't grow up in King James. I had no one bullying me or pressuring me to think the King James was perfect or anything like that. I just would read things, and I was just coming to conclusions. I was like, actually, I proved myself wrong here. I ended up writing 3 articles on why the definition of Easter is true, and why it means resurrection. People like James White and Dan Wallace and these other guys were saying it was a pagan festival. Ishtar, which is a load of rubbish. It's not related to Ishtar. Uh, and it's not related to Yosta, which is apparently the Anglo-Saxon goddess. And I sort of proved that she never really existed, except in the small bit of writing of Bede. And Bede was prone to just sort of give stories and names to months and times and things like that and speculate. And so basically, at the end of it, I discovered that Easter basically comes from the German, from the Teutonic. It comes from Uster, where we see that in like Austria, or the Österreicher, which is the Eastern Reich. It comes from the word Easter, east, the rising of the sun, um, star, Erst, which is first, Ersterhang, which means resurrection. And so Easter is actually from the German Oster, which is from or Hung, which means resurrection. And so it actually means resurrection. And so I didn't realize that. So after a while, I got to the stage where I got this information from King James only people. And so I wrote these articles, and I was really grateful to these King James only guys, and kept reading more and more of their information and kept finding more and more truth and kept proving myself wrong. So that's a completely different scenario to growing up in a place where they're bombarding you. So I know if you get Gippites, Sam Gipp says Easter's a pagan festival. So there's obviously different schools, like David mentions a little bit later, of King James onlyism sort of thing, or TR only, whatever. They all just get lumped in the same bag anyway. But obviously there are thinkers and there's non-thinkers, and there are people who are searching for truth, and there's people who are not searching for truth. There are people who have a wrong conclusion and people who have a correct conclusion, and that's why I always say when I put anything out there, I'm like, if I'm wrong, guys, please tell me. I love people being critical of what I say, because sometimes I'll pioneer a bit of a work and think outside of the box, and it's like, what do you think, guys? And no one really looks at it or critiques it. And that's why I love it. Even in that debate with Stephen Boyce, it made me go through a bunch of stuff. And I was like, actually, I'm more right than I think, and that's why I made a whole bunch of other videos on that. But let's let David continue.
Right. They're agreed on one thing: King James onlyism is is silly. And so, I also found out why, right? Because the story wasn't what I'd been told. It wasn't that my King James Bible was just exactly like this majority text, and like this is what most of the manuscripts say, right?
So this is one thing that David brings out quite a few times, is the King James Bible is based upon the majority text. Now, there's quite a bit of deception in critical text circles about what the majority text is, and I think some people are confused over what the majority text is. And so there are several majority texts. Okay, so you've got uh, ones by Robinson and Pierpont, I think it is. Actually, I've got it right here. Um, anyway, you've got one by Hodges and Farstead. So the Hodges and Farstead one, so these are the guys who did the New King James Version. So none of the people who actually did the New King James Version were TR people. They were all either modern critical text people or they were for the majority text. So the main leaders of that, Farstead, he was a majority text guy. And so when I say majority text guy, the labeling majority text was a roundabout term for the Textus Receptus because most of the time it's the majority. So if you were just to get a Byzantine text and you were to get the TR text, most of the time they read the same, except for a few little scattered places here and there. 1 John 5:7. We talked about Revelation 16:5. We talked about these other places, and Luke 2:22. And so we find that these places there it might be reversed, where you might have 1,000 manuscripts and you've only got 10 that sort of back up your reading, or sometimes they're even, sometimes it goes to that extreme. But the thing is, the critical text is usually the minority all the time. And sometimes they turn around and they have the majority on a few tiny little points. But that's when we're only looking at the Greek text. Okay, so, but I'll just stay with the majority text issue here first, just to not confuse anyone. So the majority text was a label that people gave to the King James. The King James, or basically the text receptors. So these the text receptors had a bunch of labels. They called it the Greek Vulgate. So we had the Latin Vulgate, but we also had the Greek Vulgate. It was called the received text. So just because, say, someone didn't receive it doesn't mean you can't call it received text. You know what I mean? And so just because there are some minority readings scattered through the text receptors doesn't mean that it can't be called the majority text, because that was just a label that was given to it, that just sort of ended up being there. It's not like they had a committee and they said we're going to call it the majority text. See what happened then later on. People were saying, okay, well the text receptus is based upon the majority text, and what happened was when they started printing a thing called the majority text, people got confused. Now, like, is the King James based upon that? But it's like, no, that's a totally different thing. So what you had was people getting um, the work of Caspar Rene Gregory, and they were going through his collations and compiling what's called the majority text. It says it on the front, the majority text, and so it's a printed edition. So that really has nothing to do with the TR historically being called the majority text. It's a totally chalk and cheese. And so you can't grab the majority text and go, oh, hang on, the TR doesn't match the majority text. It's the TR was called the majority text. And so imagine if tomorrow I brought out a book called the Greek Vulgate. Okay. Now, historically, the King James has been called the Greek Vulgate. Hundreds of years, for hundreds of years, it was called the Greek Vulgate, and scholars would call it that. Now, if I brought out a volume tomorrow called the Greek Vulgate, and it differed from the text receptors, differed from the King James, and you go, hang on, I thought that the King James was based upon the Greek Vulgate, but it doesn't match up with it. So that's what's happened with the majority text. And so people like James White, they know this. They know that there's this confusion. They know that there has been this volume printed called the majority text, or that there's a few volumes out that are the majority text, and they actually disagree with each other, but on certain points. And so that brings confusion. It's a bit like if I had the Message Bible. Okay. Now imagine in the 1980s, I do a whole sermon series on the Message, and there we go. Um, And so, but that has nothing to do with the Message Bible. So it's like that's the confusion. It's like, oh, it's not based on the majority. Okay, so then what is the majority text? Okay, so the majority text is basically just one part. It's one leg of a three-legged stool, and so you have one leg is the majority text. You have the other leg is the Latin. Then you have the other leg is the early church writings of the Greek and Latin church, what they would call the church fathers. I like to call them the early church writers. And so these are the three closed class of witnesses that we go to. We go to the majority text, but we understand that every stream of manuscripts became corrupted. And that's just normal. That's just part of life. In the Latin, there were things that crept in, that crept out. Same happened in the Greek. The same happened in the Syriac. The same happened, and so things have got to be taken into consideration. If you're looking at the Arabic, you've got to go, okay, well, what seems to have floated in and floated out of this, and then they have their own. Every single language has their own received type of text in that, and so what Erasmus did is he got the leg of the majority text or the Byzantine text, and he said, okay, let's look at that. But he also had done a Latin translation, and so he was um, using the Greek to fix the Latin that he had, because the Latin had become corrupted, just like any other language, just like any manuscript stream. And so, but he was using then the Latin to polish the Greek. Then he was looking at the early church writings to confirm what he had done. And so these three things are all put together. It's not just the majority text, and we just go by the majority text. And so I hear this quite a few times. And so obviously there are, I believe that David Pallmann, he's not going to lie about his testimony and all this stuff. But I believe that he must have been around some people who were teaching. Oh, it's just based on the majority text. If I ever said that, I would say the King James Bible, the Textual Receptus, is based upon the majority of manuscripts. But I would have the caveat: there are places where there are minority readings, but many times we would go to either the Latin, or we would go to the early church writers, or that's only the external evidence. We would go to the internal evidence where I say 1 John 5:7. There's a huge solecism that's in the text if you take that verse out. So in the critical text, it's grammatically an abortion. And so if you go through the Greek there, you can clearly see anyone who knows Greek fluently can clearly see that there's a solecism there. A bit like if we saw a sentence that said a apple, we would know it should be an apple, and so people know good English. We just instinctively know these things, and so in that section, there's a grammatical error, and so that needs to be taken into consideration, and that's why the 1904 Greek Bible has the comma in it. Even though they look back in history and they're like, we feel that the comma was dropped out of the Greek, and so out of like about 500 Greek manuscripts that have 1 John, there's only like about 8 or 10 manuscripts that people are saying contain the comma or it's in a margin or whatever. And so, but most people are like, well, we think it's fallen out of the Greek, and so. Um, and that could be due to homoioteliaton, parablepsis, where it's similar endings. And when you look through that, it talks about there are three that bear record in heaven: the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these three are one. And there are three that bear record in earth: the Spirit, the water, and the blood, and these three agree in one. And it's talking about witnesses. It's talking about in one. It's talking about three. And so the chance for someone writing that to skip some lines, or the chance that that verse being one of the greatest verses to defend, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit being one, was taken out. Constantine's successor was an Arian. There's a lot of evidence that can um, push us in many different directions to see why someone would take that out. So it's not just majority text. It's we look at the external evidence and we look at the internal evidence. We look at the consistency. It talks about the two witnesses. It says the witness of God is greater. So it's talking about the witness on in heaven and the witness on earth, and it talks about who the witness of God is greater. And so so I just thought I'd mention that. So I'll let David continue.
And also, if you want to deny it, right, you're gonna deny the Trinity, because the King James, it's 1 John 5:7, right? So one thing that was huge for me is when I discovered that 1 John 5:7 is not in the majority text. And that was like, I was like, okay, hang on, because you can't have your cake and eat it too. If you're going to say we're going with the majority of manuscripts, we're going with what the majority text says, but then you also want to say, oh, and people who disagree with the King James, they just want an excuse to deny the Trinity. I'm like, you can't have both of those arguments. Because if you have...
Okay, so the thing is, 1 John 5:7, there might be, my own guesstimation is there's about 1,000 manuscripts of 1 John 5:7 in the Latin. And so it's in 95% of those. So in the Latin, it's full. In the early church writings, quotations, Cyprian, Tertullian, Origen, Priscillian, Jerome, it's in so much of the early church writings that it's obviously a verse that they were using and quoting. And when we look at, it's not in the majority text. So basically, critical text people, like, there's no pleasing someone like Bart Ehrman or Dan Wallace or James White on these issues. Don Carson. These guys say in, I know David later on brings up the last 12 verses of Mark. Now, so we only have two manuscripts out of 1,600 that don't have the last 12 verses of Mark. It's Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. And so it's obviously the last verses. So usually copyists who don't translate like something like that, it's probably because the last page fell off. It's quite logical that could have happened. And not just, we've just omitted that. And the thing is, too, even someone like James Snap, he's not a King James only guy. He's just, he's got his own sort of thing going, equitable eclecticism, I think he calls it. So he's gone through, done his homework, and basically come to very similar conclusions as text receptors King James people, that there is enough room for the text there, that if you go through it without squishing all the letters and everything, you can actually, write out the missing words, the last 12 verses there. So there's only two manuscripts that don't have that. 1,600 do, so that would be the majority. But the thing is, say 1 John 5:7, where you have that whole thing reversed. Like I said, there's other evidence. There's a Latin. You've probably got, say 950. Just say there's 1,000 Latin manuscripts. 950 have it, 50 don't. So it is in the majority of the Latin, and so it's in many early church writings. So that's got to be taken into consideration. But the thing is, I say to people, okay, so how many manuscripts would it have to be in, say 1 John 5:7? How many manuscripts would it have to be in for the critical text guys to include it? If we had 50 that had it, would they include it? No, they wouldn't. If we had 100 that had it, if we had 99% of the manuscripts had it, they still wouldn't put it in because Vaticanus and Sinaiticus don't have it. So pretty much what you learn after a while is that the critical text is basically based upon Vaticanus. Sometimes they'll go with Sinaiticus. It's sort of like they do favor Vaticanus quite a lot, but when these two agree, it's like that just sort of finishes it. They don't really even look at anything else. So the whole embarrassment of riches by someone like Dan Wallace is actually the Byzantine text, majority text, that they reject. They regulate to just an M or a BYZ in the apparatus, and it could be 1,500 manuscripts. It's just regulated to an M. Okay, that one has it. The majority text has it. Byzantine text has it, and that's it. And it's like they want to look at these other ones, so Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, which disagree. So 3,000 times just in the Gospels there's disagreement, but they say they're from the same family. But the thing is, there's so much disagreement with them that it's like, how can these be related? And so anyway, hopefully there's some things that I've said there that can spark a bit of interest into studying those things.
The majority text, you don't get 1 John 5:7. You want 1 John 5:7, you don't get the majority text. And so kind of what it came down to is that they were really just starting with this presupposition that, oh, the King James, it's perfect. So anything that, supports it, well, anything that's reflected in a manuscript there, that accurately reflects the original. But wherever something departs from the King James, well, that a manuscript's just not accurate there.
Not really. The issue is, like, say if I was a critical text guy and I was given the information that there was a huge solecism in 1 John 5:7 in my text, that doesn't have the comma, I would have to deal with that and either think that God put grammatical errors into the text, or that there's something missing there. See, with the comma in there, there's no issue. There's no grammatical errors. And it flows, it reads well, it's been quoted all throughout history. How did these early church writers quote it? And that's the thing. Someone like Dan Wallace, he comes up with, they've just obviously they were just trying to have a Trinitarian spin on verse 8, the Spirit, the water, and the blood, and they were trying to bring it up and say, oh, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit. And so they sort of added it as a marginal note. It ended up being, so this blunderous sort of thing just so happens to fix this grammatical error. How does that happen? Yeah, and so the grammatical error is true. And this is one of the things, the hardest reading is true. This is part of textual criticism. And so they have bizarre, weird readings because it's like, well, the hardest reading must be true. And so, and I've mentioned this before in the debate with Stephen Boyce, but 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16, where it says, God was manifested in the flesh, it's changed to who appeared in the body. It has a predicate without a subject, which is probably the greatest grammatical error in the whole Nestle Aland text. It's a mess. And so that's why Hort, he made up out of thin air that Paul broke into song while he was singing. While he was singing, he just started saying, great is the mystery of godliness, who appeared in a body, and he started singing this hymn. And it's just sort of cut and pasted in there. And that's why the grammar changes so abruptly, and it's so strange. We had to have a predicate without a subject. And so this is all the way through the critical text, and this is something which needs to be looked at. This is someone who's pursuing intellectual things. They need to go through these things and look at and answer this. Because just to say, oh, the King James is just stupid, or the text receptus, or should be based on the majority text, or it's out, or whatever. It's like, well, what about all these other considerations? And so, and that's why I'm doing this video, sort of to challenge thinkers, to challenge people to look at these things and to respond intellectually.
And so what they'd really done is they weren't basing this on any kind of evidence like I had been told. I was told, we're just going with the majority of manuscripts, right? Oh, well, that makes sense. Only you're not. And so this was really scandalous to me because I kind of felt lied to in some ways. After, because first I just thought my professors and stuff, oh, well, surely they're not, they just don't know this stuff, right? And I was incredibly naive at the time, if this isn't obvious. I thought they just don't know this. And surely they're going to be as interested in these facts that I'm discovering as I am. And so I would go to my professors and I was like, oh, look at the textual evidence. And kind of to my shock is this was not news to them. They were very well aware that 1 John 5:7 wasn't in the majority text.
I actually don't know anyone who doesn't know that. It's sort of like, and I guess that's one of the things is you guys are in America. You guys have independent fundamentalist Baptist churches, and I've heard you yes, sermons from people, and it's really strange and weird and all the rest of it. But people who I know online, I run the Texas Receptus webpage, have millions and millions of views. I'm running different groups and things on Facebook, and always just chatting about this issue. And I don't know anyone who would think that 1 John 5:7 is based upon the majority of manuscripts, or who would ever claim that. It's just, people would say that the Texas Receptus, like I was saying, is, and I guess that can be one of the things is people like Dean John William Burgon, he would have said back in his day, he would have just called it the majority text, and the Greek Vulgate, and he had all these names for it. And then, 150 years later, or whatever, they're bringing out an edition of the majority text. So those things are being conflated. But also, it's got to be understood that Dean John William Burgon, he was not a Texas Receptus guy. And neither was Scrivener, neither was Hoskier, neither was Miller. These guys were basically majority text guys, like Hodges and Farstead. And so um, they weren't as full on as those guys, but they didn't like the TR. And many times they were saying, "Oh, we prefer this other reading, and we want to change the text and do this." So they weren't like Theodore Beza or the King James translators. They weren't like that. They had enough bullets to come against the crazy theories of Westcott and Hort and Tregelles and Tischendorf and people of that era. A bit like sort of James Snap. He has a lot of bullets that he can fire against someone like James White or whatever. But it's like. They were actually anti-TR people, just like James Snap is an anti-TR person today. And so sometimes people get, like say the Dean Burgon Society, it's an unfortunate name because Dean Burgon, he was never really, 100% TR. And so sometimes he would claim things that made him look like that. But when the acid was put on him and he was questioned directly, he would say, "No, I'm not advocating for the Texas Receptors." And so, yeah, Scrivener, he was basically anti-TR. I think he was one of the main guys of that whole century who was coming against the TR. And so there can be this confusion amongst, King James only people that they're told, "Oh, read Burgon, read Miller, read Hoskett," and they're seeing terms like majority text, and they're saying, "Oh, it's based on the majority text." So that's the only thing. I'm only just sort of speculating why they would do that. But yeah, it's definitely wrong. And I'm not saying that you're lying about it or anything like that. I'm just saying that you experience that, but it's I don't see that happening. It's not like a common thing for people to say 1 John 5:7 is based upon a majority or whatever. People might conflate those two things, but I usually find it's the critical text guy saying the King James isn't based on the majority text, and it's like, well, yeah, that's only one leg of the stool. There's the Latin, and there's the early church writings, and then there's the flip side with the internal consistency.
And yet they would continue from the pulpits and in the classrooms to say this. And I would hear them say this after I had approached them about this. And so I was kind of starting to find out that it was kind of hard because these are the people I believe you can trust pastors, right? You can trust evangelists. These are the people I was supposed to be able to trust. And I'm hearing them effectively I don't know how you that cannot be lying. Or minimally it's presenting half truths and partial truths in such a way that's constructed to just push an agenda forward. And that really, really bothered me. I felt lied to at that point when I was.
And so that's one of the things that I sort of see throughout this video is when you've been really offended like that, you've had someone lie to you and you've had someone, do something full on to you, it can be really hard to pull back and go, well, but hang on, they might have said all these wrong things and everything, but it's like at the end of the day, yeah, how does that play out with my view of the Texas Receptus and the King James? Has that become skewed because I've had this attack on me? And so, you know, if you're attacked by a communist, it's like, oh, all communists are like that, or you're attacked by a capitalist, all capitalists are like, and you get this mindset, and so we've got to be careful, like I was saying earlier, to not have experience-based theology where we are reacting to how we've been treated and sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater on that issue. And especially if you've gone through and you've done the Ehrman thing and the Wallace thing and probably James White and a bunch of others, and then you're sort of like, okay, I'm convinced that King James only is stupid, and you're not looking at arguments against what they're saying. And so that's, I guess, why I'm doing this video, is to just dig deeper.
It's like being told that, like, from the pulpit, what you're telling people from the pulpit, all right, is that the reason that we should believe the King James is because it matches the majority of manuscripts. And you're not going to tell them that 1 John 5:7, that one's not even in those majority of manuscripts that you're getting the rest of your Bible from. And I mean, again, this is just one example. I was discovering a lot of things like this. That was really a big red flag. And so
like, when I was studying this, I would find people like Jack Mormon. He's just recently passed away. So he wrote a book called When the Textus Receptus Departs from the Majority Text. He wrote a whole book on it. And so I've had that for years on my computer. I've referenced it often, look at different places and try and study these little quirky things out. And so it's never been, and so it's not like, like I was saying, it's not like a topic which many people are bringing up this majority text thing and saying, oh, it's based on majority text. Most people are saying, the majority text is part of it, but we understand that the Greek became just as corrupt as the Latin, became just as corrupt as the Syriac, because of it was handwritten. Everything that's handwritten eventually, if it's goes through time, it eventually things become lost, things become dropped out. And so that's why it's so good to have, with the Bible, so many different languages and so many different manuscripts and so many different early church writings and things like that, so we can examine all these things. And that's what I believe happened with the Textus Receptus, and it culminated in the King James. And we have the correct reading today.
Like, I had to let go of the King James only issue, because I mean, it wasn't what they were telling me it was. And I understand, I learned later that there are different types of King James onlyism, but you've got like Ruckmanism and stuff. But this was the sort that I was in that said that, oh, well, we're just following the majority text. That's a lie. They were not. So that was a big thing for me right there. I don't know if you want to come in with because I know the King James issue.
And I appreciate his honesty there in a sense where he's just like, look, I've heard there's a whole bunch of other things, but that's what I was involved in. And that's the thing. It's like, I don't know what's happening all over the world and all the rest of it, but the majority, I've never heard that. The majority text that the King James is just based upon that. Usually it's, critical text guys saying.
It was a big one for you as well.
I mean, it's not like I have a whole series on it and I just keep poking that bear. I'll be honest, I enjoy poking the bear because the evidence is stacked against it, and I just love seeing the meltdowns happen. But it's also great because it's so many people. It allows them to when the King James only issue falls apart for so many because it's such a chief issue in the IFB. It almost gives them permission to start looking to other issues. So that's why I've devoted so much time to King James onlyism. I have nothing against the King James. As still is written very poetically, is beautifully written. It's a translation of a particular compilation of a particular group of texts. That's what it is. And so, to that point, I felt the same way. Because again, I think when you're young and you're on fire for God and you're like, oh yeah, I'm doing all the things, ministry and all the stuff, you think you're naive because you think that these professors are probably just as genuine as you are. And I'll be cynical here. Many of them are doing it purely for self-preservation. Like it's because, well, I know that this is false, but my career is depending on this. So I'm going to keep teaching it. And what happens is that they end up sacrificing the questioners on the altar of their self-preservation.
There's a few things there, but it's quite ironic because that's exactly what I say about the other side. Someone like Mark Ward or someone like James White or Dan Wallace or the people in Munster or the billion-dollar Bible industrial complex. That's you go into a Bible bookshop and it's just ESVs, NIVs, see you name the acronym. They've got versions of it. They've got women's devotional Bibles. They've got kids pretending to be toy soldier Bibles. They've got everything. Yeah, and that's fine. You can have all that, but it's like I'm talking about devotional Bibles and all the rest of it. But the translations just continually coming out. It's a juggernaut, and even people like James White say it's because of money. And it's like, and so you've got people like, say, someone like Mark Ward. Um, you know, obviously he's got a job that pays for him to sort of come against the King James and to say all this stuff. And, James White, he's written a book. His best-selling book is the King James only controversy. He's making money on it. How much money am I making off it? I'm paying like $500 a month for a website that I run. I'm not making a cent. Every now and then someone throws $5, $10, and but there are, some people who support what I'm doing, but because I do a bunch of other stuff, but very rarely is it just, hey, I want to support this, just one thing here with the text receptors, King James stuff you're doing. And so it's, you know, but then I'm not saying that these guys are lying either because that's their experience. And obviously, in the Bible Belt in America, there would be preachers there who are just playing the game. I would recommend anyone to look up a movie called Marjoe. I think it's Marjoe, and it's basically about a guy who's sort of like a faith healer type of guy and charismatic and Pentecostal, and he goes around churches doing his thing. But his whole movie is himself basically exposing himself as a fake. So he goes around, he said, I'm just tired of being fake. And so he had this film crew go with him. And then at the end, he's there smoking and he's there counting the money from offerings. He's just saying, look, it's so easy to get money from people. You just pray for them. Just say, come up with $10 in your hand and I'll pray for you straight away. And so people come up with $10 and he just makes a fortune. And, so it's sort of like it's just showing that there are charlatans out there are scammers out there. And so I'm not saying that there wouldn't be people who do the King James thing to get money. It probably happens all the time. But I'm sort of saying that it seems to me to be more so on the other side where the real money's made. Like someone like James White, someone like Dan Wallace, people who are running schools and the text and canon guys. You look at people like, say, Robert Truelove and Jeff Riddle, and they're not really making any money from their King James and TR stuff that they do. They're just getting ridicule from people. But it's like people like Mark Ward, that they're able to sell books, they're getting published, they're getting money from it. And so I just see that, when he brought that up, I was like, well, that's sort of exactly what I say about the other side. So anyway, interesting.
And I know that sounds really harsh, but it is what it is. Because what ends up happening is a lot of people, once they find that something's false, they end up questioning all of Christianity because they have no idea about Christian apologetics. Because the IFB, it does not do apologetics, because apologetics, it encourages critical thinking and a diversity of thought. You can't allow apologetics in the IFB if it's all got to be singularly thought. It's very much a hive mind in that sense. So a lot of times people, I know plenty of people who were from the IFB who are now like outspoken atheists. It's just because once they started questioning and they realized that somebody, like you were saying, was straight up lying at worst, they just started questioning everything and they had no answers to any of the questions. So they just fell off the grid entirely. So anyway, just when you're saying that there, it's just like, yep, totally understand that. Cause I remember I was deeply impassioned and had problems with that too. Felt very lied to. And then people to this day will tell me that I have too much bitterness. It's not really bitterness. It's just falsehood is falsehood. And the more we can break people out of the cult thinking and the indoctrination of that, the better Christianity is going to be. So anyway, not to steal your thunder and go on my own tangent, but anyway, so go ahead and continue. So King James onlyism is what broke there. So what's sort of kind of flowing from this?
Well, and so one other thing that's kind of interesting on that point was that I was also discovering my professors, they didn't agree with each other on a lot of these things. Like, because I would set up meetings with them, right? Because they seemed like the smartest people around, right? And everyone told me, like, oh, if you're having doubts and questions, you gotta talk to brother this guy, you gotta talk to brother this guy. But some of them like called themselves doctors, which I found out was like, you probably shouldn't call yourself a doctor if you got your PhD from certain institutions. But anyway, some of them had no problem calling themselves doctors.
Honorary at best, too. Like, oh, an honorary doctorate from a place with 100 students. Okay.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So, but with that's a whole nother issue, is the phony.
And just on that, it's so true. I mean, you can do a study, like say the study of Easter. Like I've been studying that for nearly 20 years, and I've written on it, and I'm halfway through writing a book on it. It just keeps growing and growing and growing. And but people who are doctors, they were, Dr. James White. These guys, I shared my information with Dr. White back in 2009. Straight away, he called me a Ruckmanite. It's like, oh, okay, so I'm like Peter Ruckman apparently, because I believe Easter is not a pagan festival, and Ruckman actually believes it is a pagan. Well, we did when he was alive. He believed it was a pagan festival. I was just like, how does that fit? But yeah, people with doctorates and things like that usually. I find it's just there is a market, especially in the United States. It seems like when people have doctor or PhD, people just follow them, and they tend to believe them more. Like if there was someone come out on stage and they say, "Oh, this guy's got a PhD," people would pay more attention to him than someone who's probably studied something for 20 times as long and has way better conclusions, is way better spoken. They wouldn't pay that same attention to that person anyway. So it's a bit of a digression, but I totally agree.
Credential, because like on one hand they'll bash credentials, right? Like we don't care about credentials, but then like they'll try to make up phony ones, which. So I'm not going to go off on that. So anyway, but no, it was kind of describing that they disagreed with each other, right? Because I would have some professors telling me, like when I talk about like the last 12 verses of Mark, for example, some of my professors were very adamant. Oh yeah, that was in the original Gospel of Mark. But one of my professors, who is he's one who I continue to have some respect for. He said that he told me, oh, I don't think that the last 12 verses of Mark were in the original. When Mark wrote it, they weren't there, but God wanted them to be in there, so he saw that they got in there later. I'm like, so he forgot to get them in there the first time? I mean, that just seems like so like the I don't know. It's like he was just wanted, like he had to push the narrative. It's like you said, his career depended on this. He wanted to be honest with the evidence, but on the other hand, he knew he couldn't just say that these weren't there. So he had to cook up this other story about how, oh, God wanted it in there, so we got it in there later.
I actually had a guy from Assemblies of God Church in Byron Bay, and he asked me if I thought that it was genuine. I said absolutely, and he didn't know my position on the TR, KJV, or anything at the time, and we were just having dinner together, and he said, well, I don't think it's genuine. I said, oh, okay. And he said, but I think what it does, it actually helps that when it was inserted into Scripture, people thought it was genuine. So that means that these gifts were actually there, because he's a continuationist, believing in the gifts, and he's Pentecostal and charismatic, whatever. He branded himself. So he's like, well, tongues and healing and all this is all there. So when they put it in, they're like, yeah. And so the early church agreed with it being there, and then that was enough. That because it had these stories in it of the miraculous, that they accepted it, proving then that the miraculous was quite a common thing in those days. And so I understand that sort of thing. But the thing is, at the end of the day, just look at the data. The last 12 verses of Mark, 1,600 manuscripts have it. It's quoted consistently from the early church writers all the way through. It's only really had a huge amount of doubt put on it in pretty much the last 50 years, 100 years. And so basically, what we're saying is the church has had it wrong for basically 1900 years. And so this is one of the things that all the way through this, I don't see David turning around and saying, "Well, I think that this Greek text is the one," or "I think Tyndale House or the NA28 is the one because I've studied it out and I've come to that conclusion," or "This Bible version is the best Bible because it's based upon this and that, and they add this in and do this and do that." It's like it's just sort of like it's not the King James. And then, many times I'm not sure if this is David's opinion or this other guy's. I guess I'll find out the other guys as I go through his videos. But many times it will be a whole smorgasbord of Bible versions, which many times contradict themselves. Sometimes the NIV will contradict later editions of the NIV. It's like, but then now you've got these competing Greek texts. You got the text of Luckman, then you got the text of Tischendorf, and then you got the text of Westcott and Hort, then you got the text of Nessel, and you got the Nessel Allen text, and you got the 28th editions come out. So there's 27 before that, and I understand it hasn't really changed since the 26th edition, but it's but then you have the Tyndale House edition, and so it's like, oh, there's no real Greek text. It's just sort of oh, there's different types of truths out there. We're not really sure where the Word of God is. It's just sort of floating around somewhere, and we can get the main gist. And that's what I find with a lot of people who are are saying they're leaving fundamentalism. It's like, well, so many times they're not really nailing down, 1+1 = 2, okay, but then it's like 1+1 = sort of, what do you feel about it? I know there's 12 different answers we can give, or there's a million different answers we can give, and so pick one. And it's like, there is ultimate truth. And that's one of the things that's one of the dangers I see in this type of thinking is, you can have, I'm all for an open mind, but sometimes you can open your mind up so much that your brains fall out, you know what I mean? And there is this whole thing of no absolutes, no moral absolutes, but no absolutes in anything. Your truth. What's your truth? My truth. Oh, they're different truths. And no, there's fact and there's fiction. And so anyway, I'll continue.
I mean, and like he did, like, was God trying to confuse us? So, like, knowing that we would find manuscripts of Mark without it in there, but we find other ones in there, and somehow we were just supposed to know that, like, these ones were the ones he wanted us to use.
It was all Satan's deception, remember? Because whenever there was a variation, it was a Satan perverting the text. That's what the excuse was. Like, so wait, what disagrees with the King James is Satan corrupting the word of God. Yes. So Satan has the ability to completely overtake God's ability to preserve his word.
So I'm not really sure what he's getting at there. I mean, at the end of the day, there is ultimate truth. Where is the word of God then? It's like, and the manuscript evidence, when we say the majority, the majority of Latin, Greek, early church writings back up the TR. And so there's a few places here and there where we're like, okay, well, the Greek became corrupted, and it's like, we have to do a whole bunch of extra work in those places. But at the end of the day, the Bible wasn't lost. The Bible was always there. And people who did their homework, like Erasmus, like Stephanus, like Theodore Beza, the King James translators, if you did your homework, you came to correct conclusions. And so it's not like the King James is just against all the manuscripts. It's basically against Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. Erasmus knew about Vaticanus and said it was a corruption. He said it was a corrupt manuscript. When Sinaiticus came on the scene, it's like, this is corrupt. It's full of errors. It's full of weird Gnostic things. It's full of bizarre readings. It's full of mistakes. The scribes were sloppy. And so, just read Dean John William Burgon's critique on these things. You know, read Hoskey on these. These guys aren't TR guys. These guys, they like I said, had enough bullets to come against Westcott Hort and defeat them. But read their views on it. It's quite eye opening to see how many errors are in those manuscripts. So if you just get manuscripts that are filled with errors and filled with different endings, and Jesus basically died from having a spear shoved into him. That's how he died in Sinaiticus. And it's like, how do you, if you have so many grammatical issues, if you have so many solecisms, you have so many genealogical problems, you're going through uh, one genealogy, it doesn't match up with the Old Testament, it doesn't match up with anywhere. And it's like, people like Metzger just go, oh, well, Matthew made the mistake, not Sinaiticus and Vaticanus have got it wrong here, or one of them have got it wrong. No, the original authors made a mistake. And so what you got to see is there's a huge bias toward these manuscripts. Erasmus rejected it, Stephanus rejected it, Beza, the King James translators, John Mill, 1707, said rejected it. And so it's basically been resurrected in these last days. Like, oh, we've got the Bible here. They knew about it. Erasmus knew about Vaticanus and rejected it as a corruption. So people have known about Sinaiticus and they've rejected it as a corruption. And so these are things that have got to be taken into consideration, because they're the two main pillars of the other texts. And so, but the thing is, what I find is many times people aren't turning around, like even James White, he doesn't say, okay, I follow the Nissel Allen 28 text. He's like, oh, Tyndale House. But I know there's things in Tyndale House text that he doesn't agree with. So he doesn't really have a Greek text. He doesn't have one that lines up with an original or whatever. And so that's where you get people saying there are no Greek texts that are accurate, as long as we get the main gist sort of thing. And it's sort of like, the whole thing of important doctrines, well, this doctrine is unimportant. It's like, to who? It's like when you read Revelation chapter 22 and it says, if you tamper with the words of this book, your name will be taken out of the book of life. Now, I know both of these guys said they're not really into once saved, always saved, and I'm not into it either. And so it's like, well, that's one of the greatest verses saying that you can lose your salvation. And so don't, or take away from the words. And at least they would have to admit that it's talking about the book of Revelation, but I believe it's talking about the whole counsel of God. And when you read in Deuteronomy and Proverbs, it talks about this type of theme all throughout the Bible. And so it's clearly saying, don't do this. You will lose your salvation. Your name will be taken from the book of life. But, can these guys show me their alternative? Yes, this is the Greek Bible that I have. It's specifically this one. It's in, or it's just like this, or we're working on it, or it's just not the TR, and it's not the King James. And see, that's the thing. If they were to look at the critical text with the same type of critique, they would see mountains and mountains of problems. And that's what I turn around and say, well, aren't they looking at these texts with an open mind, critiquing it? Because to just come against the King James and say it's wrong, Bart Ehrman and Dan Wallace agree. Well, that's just an appeal to scholarship. And at the end of the day, King James only is, and many times it's like, it's just a few backwards guys, Ruckman, and these guys will do crazy things. It's like, oh, and I'm a King James guy, and people just, the James White's, he's classic with this. He's just got the low hanging fruit. He aims for the low hanging fruit, and he holds this up as like the standard. Oh, they're all like this. They're all crazy, sort of thing. It's like, I wouldn't do that to Calvinists. I wouldn't say, oh, they're all Westboro Baptists, the guys who hold up the sign saying God hates fags and all that sort of stuff. I wouldn't, they're Calvinists, but I wouldn't say that every Calvinist is like that. That would just be a slander. But that's what we see constantly with this movement against the King James, against the TR guys. It's like, you can sort of say whatever you want against these guys. You can basically say they're not saved and they're heretics and all the rest of it, and that seems to be fine. So it's sort of weird that people will say oh we can all disagree on these things, but when it comes to this issue, it's like, oh, we're all sort of agreed that if you're a King James only guy, you're basically going to hell. And so anyway,
that's what you're saying. Satan is stronger than God. Just consider what you're saying there. Just take a minute. So
yeah, it was funny. Like Joseph pointed out, and we were arguing with one of the other students about this once, and he was like, "Oh, well, all these older texts, you can't trust them because they're corrupted, right?" And Joseph, I think he'd been reading Bart Ehrman as well, and he said to this other student, he said, "If what you're saying is right, the atheists would love that." He said, "If what you are saying is correct, that all of our oldest, most reliable manuscripts are not actually reliable." Like,
so you notice oldest and most reliable manuscripts. So he's thinking they're oldest. So you basically got a Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. Most people date these to around 350, 400 AD, and so are they the oldest? Well, complete volumes, in a sense. You can say, they're very old and for their size, but at the end of the day, there's early church writings that are older. And so when the early church writers have the Pericope Adulterae, have the last 12 verses of Mark, have these things, when there are earlier versions, so we're just talking about the Greek here, when there's earlier Latin, say the Capitula, which has, the Pericope Adulterae in the Latin, in the 2nd century, written in the list of what it has in the Latin there. That's got to be taken into consideration. You've got to look at all the evidence, and that's why I always keep saying. But many people just, oh, it's just the Greek, it's just the majority text, or it's like, no, look at the Latin, look at the early church writings, and even go outside of the closed class of witnesses. Look at the Syriac, look at the Hebrew, look at the internal consistency with the Old Testament. Look at these other things. There's so much to look at, and to say that the oldest and best manuscripts, yes, that's what it says in the marginal note in the ESV or whatever, but it's like the best. The Vaticanus and Sinaiticus disagree with each other. They contradict each other. How can they be the best then? And the thing is, how come there's so many Byzantine readings in the papyri? So the whole thing is Westcott and Hort, they basically came up with this idea of a Lucianic recension, where Lucian or Lucian, however you want to say it, he basically destroyed all the proper manuscripts, and they just sort of went with this Byzantine manuscript that sort of was started around the era of Chrysostom. And so then that just became popular, and that became it. So that's why the real Bible sort of disappeared for 1,500 years. And then it's in the last days, it's like, oh, it's back. It's a bit like the Jehovah's Witnesses. Christianity died out, and then, well, it's back. Restorationist, Christianity. And so, you have that with the Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, but you have that with the Bible. The Bible got lost, and then it got found. So all through the Reformation, wrong text. All through the Byzantine, wrong text. All the Latin guys, wrong text. Because the thing is, the Latin of the Roman Catholics and the Byzantine text aren't that far away from each other. Both of them are very distant from the modern critical text. So both of them, if you read the Clementine Vulgate in 1592, it would have the Comma Johanneum in it, just like the Greek did, or Theodore Beza at that time, just like the Geneva Bible had it in it. And it's like, so the text that they have today was, Westcott and Hort, he had Unitarians working on that text. George Van Smith, I've got a video on that, so you can look at that. And so, at the end of the day, things that can't be answered, they're talking about, the preservation of God's word and all this sort of stuff. It's like, well, okay, where was your Bible through the Reformation? where was your Bible? So say, before Westcott and Hort, where, people are like, well, before 1611. Okay, before Westcott and Hort, where was your Bible? Okay, before Luckman did a Greek edition that wasn't TR based, where was the Bible? It didn't exist for like hundreds of years. And then you go, okay, where was the Bible in manuscripts? Oh, well, they have Vaticanus. Okay, that's shoved in the Vatican Library and not really copied at all. And Erasmus has rejected it. John Mill rejected it. Okay, the whole Reformation's rejected that as rubbish. Where's your Bible? It's shoved in the Vatican. Okay, and Sinaiticus is in, apparently it's in a monastery, and it's not being copied. So apparently the Word of God for 1500 years is just sitting there dormant. Then you have to get these two texts and amalgamate them to create a Frankenstein text that you've never seen before, ever. It's a brand new text, brand new Bible. And then you just so happen to have Roman Catholics like Carlo Martini, who was in line to be a pope. You've got him working on the text with the Nestle Aland guys, United Bible Society guys. You've got heretics like George Van Smith working with Westcott and Hort on the text. And he actually wrote a book saying that there was so much doctrinal change that it supported Unitarian beliefs. And he wrote a book about the doctrines that have been changed from the Westcott and Hort text. So, but we're told today there is no doctrinal change. But the guy who actually helped create it says there is. And so, so there's a whole bunch of information there. But when you go through the Byzantine text, how did the Byzantine text all of a sudden appear everywhere around the 4th century? How did it just sort of appear? How did the Byzantine text get into the papyri? Now, I've just got the cover there, but I recommend you read that book. The Byzantine Text Type and New Testament Text Criticism. It's basically, how, because Westcott and Hort basically said there was a Lucianic recension, but then when they found the papyri, they're like, actually, this has got Byzantine readings in it. So it destroyed the Westcott and Hort theory. But they'd already sort of dethroned the text of Receptor, so they're not going to go back there. So they just keep creating this other text. When Bruce Metzger was asked, he said that the critical text that he worked on, firstly what they did is they got the critical text of Westcott and Hort, and that was their basis. So the whole entire text of Westcott and Hort is an amalgamation of Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, the so-called oldest and best manuscripts that sort of went missing for 1500 years, but they're back, and they amalgamated them together to create this text they'd never seen before. And this has, this overrides the text of Receptus that was sort of received everywhere and was in the Latin, in the Greek. There was really no other text. And then the papyri shows that there's Byzantine TR readings in the papyri. So what are you going to do with that? But it's sort of like we've already got a text. Let's just let it run through Nestle for a while. Then we'll get the United Bible Society guys involved, and we'll create 28 editions of that. And then Tyndale House guys go, hang on, we want to get back to Tregelles, and so they sort of create their own little side project happening there. And then, there are quite a few other Greek texts around, majority text guys. They're like, oh, we just want to go with the majority text, which is actually not a majority. It's based on 400 manuscripts that were compiled by Caspar René Gregory and collated by Caspar René Gregory, and who was a Unitarian, by the way. And so then you come into the modern age, and you've got people like Bart Ehrman who say, well, actually, the text, when it has things like the Trinity, when it has things in it like, Jesus Christ, many times these are just added by faithful Orthodox scribes just trying to put their doctrine into the text. The Orthodox corruption of Christianity. So then that whole wave has come through. And then now you've got the CBGM. And so all these different methodologies are going up and down. But it's basically sort of like anything but the TR, anything but, look at the TR and examine that. It's like, of the oldest and best manuscripts. It's like, well, how come they're still working on that? How come they've still got the CBGM, and how come they're still, how come the Tyndale House text doesn't match up with the Nestle Aland text? How come they can't nail it and go, okay, that's it? Like the King James did. They just went, okay, let's do that. We've nailed it. It's finished. How come there's still, after Westcott and Hort, there's been no major huge discoveries after papyrus stuff, and it's like, how come they still haven't really nailed their text? They're still going to bring out more, and they're still going to change more and update more, and it's like, it's just going to go on forever. And so, anyway, I'll let these guys finish because we've only got about 2 minutes to go.
All our earliest manuscripts were corrupted. That destroys the textual base.
Well, all our earliest manuscripts, but the thing is, you compare those manuscripts with the early church writers, you compare that with the early church versions, and so you've got to take all the other things into consideration. And you've got to take into consideration that these early texts went missing for 1,500 years, and no one used them. No one was using a text like they have in the ESV or the NIV. That the geographical errors in these texts, where Jesus is going to the wrong town, where you have a swine marathon. They cast the demons into the swine and they go running for 30 kilometers. And it's, the thing is, there's so many of these errors. And that's the thing. Usually people who've never looked at the other side, they've never looked at where these errors are from. So that you might go to someone like Gail Ripplinger, or go to Peter Ruckman, and go to Sam Gipp, and you don't get really good, classy material on this. There are intellectuals out there on the internet who can provide very good answers that would satisfy you. And so you need to be looking at those guys. You need to be seeking out their answers and trying to explain why your critical text, that I'm not even sure if you support that, but why your critical text has so many geographical errors in it, why it has so many genealogical errors in it, why it has so many historical errors in it, and why the translations have so many translational errors. And so, these are things that I don't think that you guys could really answer for me. Anyway, I'll continue.
Of the Bible. The atheists would have a heyday on that. They can't do that because, again, we do have these older manuscripts. So, it was kind of like, this was a big realization. Like, if I'm going to continue to hold up King James onlyism, I'm not going to have any justification for believing in the textual reliability of the Bible. On the other hand, if I want to believe in the textual reliability of the Bible, I can't be a King James onlyist. So that was a big one there. I'm sorry, I didn't want to harp on that, but just there was so much.
Oh, I love it.
So that's a very similar thing to what, say, Dan Wallace or James White will say. TR people have no apologetic in the real world because when we're not dealing with facts, we're just sort of fudging our way through things, and we're not dealing with facts. We're not dealing with manuscript evidence, and we deal with these things, but we put it in its correct place. When things are oldest and best, and they have these labels, oh, these are the good manuscripts you go to, these are the ones are bad. Or who says so? How come people will just appeal to scholarship on those issues? Why don't you question what Bart Ehrman said, or Bruce Metzger, or Carlo Martini, or Kurt Aland, or Westcott and Hort, or can you question those guys as much as you're questioning the King James only guys, and examine their claims? Because I guarantee you, if you start going through Metzger's book and looking at what he thought about the text, you'll go, hang on, is this Bart Ehrman? You'll just see Bart Ehrman, but he just says, I'm still a Christian. Where Bart Ehrman has just gone, he's saying basically the same stuff and saying, I'm not a Christian. And that's, Dan Wallace, he said, even if we can never create the text, because even if we did create a text, we don't have the original, so we would never really know if we've created it properly or not. And it's like, these guys don't believe in preservation. Metzger, he didn't believe in inspiration. They have wacky understanding of inspiration and preservation. And so, anyway, I'll continue.
I love it. I love it. And I think our listeners need it, so it's okay. Keep going. Do what you
want.
Other
topics.
The floor is yours.
Okay, so I'll try to go through some of these other ones quicker though. There was a topic of hell. Joseph really was like working on me on that one, right? Because like I would be like, oh, and by the way, I'm sure a lot of the listeners believe that hell is eternal conscious torment, and that's fine. I'm not here to change your mind on that issue per se. I'm just
So I've got about a minute to go, but yeah. So obviously David Pallmann, he doesn't believe in hell, doesn't believe in hell that is eternal hell. So he's come out of that movement and he's thrown that out as well. So which is a real shame because it's obviously scriptural. But I'm going to continue here. We've got about a minute to go.
It was funny. He told me his whole reason for holding the King James onlyism. This is kind of a side note, but his whole reason for holding the King James onlyism was that he thought that people would have doubts if you tried to if you tried to believe so I told him he asked me, why do you believe the Bible, right? And I kind of gave my sort of historical apologetic, right? Here's why I believe it. He's like well, that's because you're smarter than most people, but most people they can't do that, so we have to stick with this King James onlyism, because if we use the sort of approach that you're using, basically most people are too dumb for the historical apologetic approach. And that was a telling conversation. But anyway, because he was honest like that, the one thing I appreciate about him is that at least he was telling me its real reason for holding the King James onlyism. Had nothing to do with the textual evidence.
And so this is one of the things that, oftentimes, say James White will get a phone call from someone and they'll say things like that or whatever. And so he'll bring that constantly up. But the thing is, that's why I guess I'm challenging, David. I don't really know the other guy. Sort of follow David on Facebook. But I guess this whole video is to challenge him to find people who are not like that. Find people who have a stable faith. Find people who have good answers. Find people who are looking for credible, logical argumentation rather than just feelings or whatever. And so, just examining this, I just want to sort of sum it up. Where I actually wrote a few things on my phone. I might just quickly have a look. So we saw that, when there was a crisis of faith, that David sort of ran to Ehrman and Wallace. And I would just challenge David to critique those guys, to critique Wallace, to critique White on these issues. Because when I've done it, I've found it very satisfying that the Textus Receptus at the King James is the Word of God. He seems to have come out of a strange sort of branch of KJV onlyism, where they were saying it's all based on majority text and all the rest of it. Whether he was hearing that wrong or whatever, I'm not really sure. But yeah, I would encourage him to look into those issues, look into the pillars of who started the majority text. That was sort of, the Dean John William Burgon, Scribner, Miller, Hoskia, and then down through to Hodges and Farstead, the Pierpont, Robinson majority text. Look at those things, and sort of get an understanding of the majority text and what it is, because I'm not sure if you've sort of grown from that and if you actually still know what's going on with that. And also just the Comma Johanneum, 95% of the Latin have it. And so, we grow up, Latin is Catholic and evil, Greek is Byzantine and good. It's like this strange sort of thing. Look into the Latin, look into what Scribner said about it. He said out of 50 manuscripts, 49 had the comma of the ones that he was looking at. So just on a bit of a ratio, so 95%. So yeah, at the end of the day, there were problems like a false view of the majority text, a false view of the Comma Johanneum. And so that can cause you, when you're given a false view, any other view can sound correct. And so what I would encourage him to do is to look at exactly what, strong TR people, Textus Receptus guys, King James guys, but actually believe with 1 John 5:7. look at someone like Jeff Riddle. Look at someone like even myself on my website. If you go to Pure Bible Forum of Stephen Avery, he's got stacks written on that. Look at Michael Maynard's book. I can send you a book called The Witness of God is Greater, or if you just go to pdfdrive.com, where there's a million free PDFs. If you just type in The Witness of God is Greater, it should be there, 1 John 5:7. That's the latest thing that's been written. A guy sends me updates of that all the time. There's just a mountain of evidence for 1 John 5:7. So I'd encourage you to read through that and then make a conclusion, because you might think that you've looked at opposing views and all the rest of it, but I would guarantee that if you're thinking that just because it's not based on the majority text and all the rest of it, that you probably haven't really advanced from there. And I just say also that people like Bart Ehrman, Dan Wallace, these guys are not neutral. You know, it's these guys they have a barrow to push. Every side has a barrow to push. You know, I'm pushing TR, I'm pushing King James stuff. They're pushing their text. You know, and so no one's really neutral, just giving facts. You know, I try to be as neutral as possible, but at the end of the day, you know, I probably do push things and see things in a certain light and all the rest of it. But you know, I'm trying to be honest here. But it's like um, Bart Ehrman, Dan Wallace, James White, um, Don Carson, yeah, these other guys, they all have a barrow to push. Anyway, so it's 2 o'clock in the morning here in Australia on a Saturday night. I'm going to bail. Hopefully you've enjoyed this. God bless you guys, and I'm going to stop the recording right here, right now. Okay, so where are we? End stream.